You know, so we all have that crazy neocon uncle who comes over for Thanksgiving or Christmas. He starts talking politics. He starts telling you how great NATO is. It's a defensive organization designed to stop communism. And you laugh and you smile at his ignorance, of course. And then Uncle Timmy gets mad, starts drinking too much. You decide to open your mouth and remind him that NATO is an offensive organization. It's actually, in many ways, a terrorist organization. You tell Uncle Timmy, stop drinking all the family wine. Start reading some books about Operation Gladio, Operation Condor, just so you understand how NATO's secret stay-behind armies have essentially been regime change tools, carried out terrorist acts around the world. Tell him to read a book, educate himself about the Bologna bombings in Italy, which were carried out by NATO's terror army, and then you tell him to stop being such a drunk old man, then he falls asleep on your couch. Well, Uncle Timmy would not like what just happened yesterday. Congressman Thomas Massie introducing a bill to essentially end NATO by having the United States leave NATO, use that money to defend our own country. Representative Paula Luna jumped on, said, yeah, she's happy to co-sponsor this bill. This is, of course, an extension of what Senator Mike Lee also is looking to do. So drunk Uncle Timmy is going to be pissed at Congressman Thomas Massie, who joins us now. Congressman, you pissed off Uncle Timmy, and I'm really sorry to hear about that.
Sorry, Uncle Tim. Just have some more eggnog.
Why did you do this?
Listen, this has been sort of a mission of mine for a long time. And I decided we needed legislation. And then the legislation becomes a vehicle to show that there's support for getting us out of NATO. We have a president who's ostensibly America first. So if we're America first, why are we subsidizing the defense of socialism in Europe? The Europeans have formed the European Union, and NATO is just basically the European Union plus America, and we're footing the bill. We pay more than half of the cost for the defense of Europe. It just doesn't make any sense in light of the national debt that we have. Also, there's a cost associated with NATO and the expansion of NATO over the years. We've sort of been poking the bear every chance we get by adding more countries to NATO. And, you know, Putin is a Cold War relic, but I think he's in response to NATO, which is a Cold War relic. As long as we keep the Cold War going on, the Russians are going to keep people like Putin in charge because he stokes their nationalism in the face of, you know, the encroachment of an ever-expanding NATO on his borders, on his front step.
Well, and as Putin has admitted that he wanted to join NATO. I mean, if I'm not mistaken, I think he specifically talked to Bill Clinton about this. Bill Clinton sort of scoffed. I mean, imagine how they wouldn't have a boogeyman anymore, right? If Russia joins NATO, we're not your enemy. Let's just be on the same team here. Sorry, we can't do that. We need you as our enemy.
And, you know, until Elon Musk came around and got a way for us to get to the space station, we were renting rides from the Russians to get to the space station, or basically to do much of anything with astronauts in our own space program. And so it's somewhat ridiculous that we have to have this proxy war now in Ukraine. Again, you know, that's a specific example of where we keep pushing forward with NATO and poking the bear. And I think the attack on Ukraine, you don't even have to think or speculate about this. Part of that was because we were talking about them joining NATO. And there may be part of the resolution of the war in Ukraine may be a promise not to have them join NATO. I think it's been irresponsible to add the other countries. The other problem with adding these smaller countries, it's sort of like an insurance pooling, right? Why would you add a small country that pays very little into the insurance when they're a big risk as far as payout goes on the insurance with this mutually assured war pact where if there's war on a NATO country, people believe that the NATO treaty obligates us to enter that war. I particularly don't agree with that interpretation of the NATO treaty because there's an article, I think it's Article 11 in the NATO treaty, that says that anything that NATO does or a member country has to be copacetic with their own constitution. Our constitution, by the way, requires declarations of war from Congress. At least it requires authorization of use of military force if there's not an imminent attack on the United States. So an attack on a NATO country doesn't satisfy the requirement in our Constitution to enable a president to have war. And even the NATO treaty acknowledges that in one of the articles.
critics say NATO is a purely defensive alliance, but of course history tells a completely different story of that, from the Balkans intervention to Libya. I mean, the list is endless, not to mention all of the terrorist acts that have been carried out by their stay-behind armies, Operation Gladio, etc. So how does your bill maybe challenge this myth of a defensive posture?
Well, whether it's defensive or offensive, I don't think we should be obligated to be on the offense for Europe or on the defense for Europe. I don't even debate whether it's offensive or defensive, although it has been offensive to Putin. And it's, again, moving the border forward with NATO by incorporating these smaller countries that don't really pay into it, and obligating ourselves to go to war if there's a scuttle there. Imagine if Ukraine was part of NATO. There are people in this government who believe we would be obligated to be at war with Russia right now, and that all of Europe would be obligated to be at war with Russia. I don't agree with that. And at that point, you are an offensive element. You're not just purely defense for your own country. You've become offense for Europe.
I mean, that would be Senator Lindsey Graham's greatest gift. Like, if you could give Lindsey Graham a birthday gift, it would be that. How much support do you have on this, Congressman? And do you see Speaker Johnson, who doesn't like to bring any bills to the floor unless they're spending bills, it seems to be a roadblock for anything that's make America put America first? Where do you see this going?
Well, I'd like to get a lot more support for it. Right now, Anna Paulina Luna, as you mentioned, has joined it. It's it's in both parties, it's in both chambers, not bipartisan, but what is that, bicameral. It's bicameral at the moment. Mike Lee actually introduced this bill to start out with, so we have support in the Senate and in the House now. And that's what it requires to turn off a treaty. To enter a treaty only requires the Senate. But if you look back historically, the way they've gotten out of treaties is to, the House, first of all, it's required in the House to fund any obligations to that treaty. So the House is somewhat responsible, but also to get out of a treaty, the House gets involved. And so I decided to lead that. And hopefully we'll get people who join this. We forced this to a vote as an amendment several years ago, and 18 Republicans joined in the effort to extract the United States from NATO. I'm not sure how many of those members are still in Congress, but this week we're approaching them and asking them, since they were yes votes on the amendment to get us out of NATO, will they sponsor the legislation to get us out of NATO?
I have so much more I want to talk with you about, but we're up against a hard break, and I know you've got to run. But I want to ask you really quickly about the Epstein, the new details from the judge, of course, who's now going to allow the files released from the 2019 arrest of Epstein. There's all these crossing paths, like what you've been doing in Congress, the 2008 materials, the 2019 materials. It's all kind of coming together. And then we get the Democrats releasing their own tranche of emails. Are you encouraged by what this judge has said about this 2019 arrest, quote unquote, arrest?
So there are 3 federal cases implicated in our Epstein Files Transparency Act. The DOJ under Trump went to these 3 federal judges, and this is the old case against Epstein, where he got the slap on the wrist and then started recommitting crimes and working with intelligence agencies for a decade or 2 after that. There's the case against Ghislaine Maxwell, and then there's the New York case, the recent case against Epstein, the reason he was in prison most recently. So there were 3 district judges who, before our legislation passed, said that they would not release the grand jury material. And now, within the last week, all 3 of those judges, I won't say they've reversed themselves, because what happened is the law changed. And so I'm glad to see that all 3 of these judges acknowledge that now that we've passed this law, they can't withhold grand jury material to avoid embarrassing people who might not be guilty. Maybe they're just mentioned. That was the reason for withholding the material before, but we explicitly prohibit redactions to prevent embarrassment. So we're already seeing movement, but be careful. There is a lot of material in the grand jury transcripts and some of the evidence that was presented, but there's even more material at the and at the FBI. Remember, if they didn't take it to the grand jury, it's not in the grand jury proceedings. And so, Kash Patel and Pam Bondi are going to be obligated to release even more material than what's in the grand jury proceedings.
Well, thanks to you. I hope people remember that. Thanks to you and your tireless work on this and going up against Speaker Johnson. And, not to blow smoke, but people need to remember this. Like, this was supposed to be something coming out of the Trump administration within the first week. And the fact that you had to go through this enormous fight is just stunning.
It's been trench warfare on this legislation since July. 5 months, Speaker Johnson drug us through this. And also the president had to reverse himself. He said this would be a hostile act to support this legislation. Ultimately, he signed this legislation. And as much as I'd like to take credit for it, I can't. It was really because the brave survivors came forward and reiterated their stories that a lot of people never heard or had forgotten. And also the people. They pushed on their senators and their congressmen, and eventually the dam gave way, and transparency and justice are going to prevail.
Yeah, even if it is a Democratic hoax. I'm glad that we're finally.
Well, now, yeah, and obviously it's not a Democratic hoax. I know you're being facetious, but Pam Bondi has said that she's going to open a new investigation in light of new material. And so we've sent her a letter. We've asked for a meeting to know what that new material is. We're a little bit suspect as to whether maybe she's trying to use the excuse of an ongoing investigation to prevent the release of some of these materials. I hope that's not a route they're taking. But even if it is, the redactions that they may make are very limited in scope, and they have to be very precise if they're going to try to claim that there's an ongoing investigation that prevents the release of some of the Epstein files. They can't prevent the release of all of the Epstein files by announcing one vague investigation.
Congressman Thomas Massie, thank you for fighting for America first, and thank you for fighting for Kentucky, and I hope you have a Merry Christmas. Thank you for taking some time out this afternoon. Thanks, Congressman.
Thank you, Clayton.